Hello and welcome to Mishak Milim, which is Hebrew for Game of Words or Word Game. My name is Shachar. Thanks for joining us. Our episodes are usually recorded in Hebrew, but this one is going to be in English. We've done an episode in English before, episode 49 with Dr. Robert Epstein. And this one will be in English as well, and we'll do it more with the relevant topics and guests. I'll present our guest in a few minutes. I just wanted to say that in this episode, we're trying 3 days before or 2 days before the election, when this comes out, the election in the U.S., to raise ourselves a little bit above the daily cacophony of Orange Man bad or radical this or that. The mudslinging is maybe sometimes entertaining, maybe sometimes it's troubling, but we are not here to talk about that in this episode. This is an episode about ideas and identity and foundational thought, and we hope that this will help you, get some refreshments before the madness of November 3rd. One small preamble before the episode is the fact that this is a topic that has been on my mind for a while, but never well articulated. It's a raw thought, raw ideas that we're talking about, at least in my head. So this episode has been a process of thought along with my great guest, and I think it's going to be visible a little bit in my on my side of the conversation. But my counterpart is Jonathan Silver. Jonathan's job is to think and discuss those ideas and those thoughts that I was not ripe with. So the conversation with him was fascinating and illuminating, and I think his articulation and his framing of those ideas has been really interesting and helpful. So who is Jonathan Silver? Jonathan is a senior director at the Tikva Fund. He's also the editor of Mosaic. The tagline of Mosaic is Advancing Jewish Thought. It's a magazine that has essays and talking about Israel and Zionism and history of ideas, and also current affairs and politics. But it has one main or more elaborate essay at least once a month. So Jonathan is the editor of that. He's also the host of the Tikva podcast, where he's conducting conversations similar to this one in a different way and different spin, but with wonderful guests. And I completely recommend that podcast to be added to your list, the Tikva podcast. So I hope you enjoy and find this episode helpful and interesting, and we're happy to get any feedback that you may have. So without further ado, I will give you Jonathan Silver. Let's go. It's time to play the game.
It's time to play the game. Time to play the game. It's all about the game and how you play it. All about control, and if you can take it, all about your debt. And if you can pay it, it's all about pay. And who's gonna make it?
Hello and welcome to Mishak Milim, the podcast where I'm trying to be, usually with Zohar, but now by myself, trying to sound smarter than I really am, and I never succeed. And if you'll think about it, you can interpret that both ways. Think about it. So I'm not completely alone today. I have a guest. My guest is Jonathan Silver. Hello.
Hey.
How are you? Hope everything's...
Shachar, I'm happy to be with you.
Awesome. Happy to have you. I will let you... I've introduced you before this in my prologue here, but I'm going to let you do it in your own words. Can you introduce yourself a little bit in a few sentences, what it is you do, and... if someone doesn't know you, so they will.
Okay, so my name's Jonathan Silver. I grew up in Western New York, wonderful family. Jewishly, we were basically assimilated and secular. We went to a Reform synagogue where I grew up, twice a year for the high holidays. My family was basically proud to be Jewish, and we never were confused or thought that we were not Jewish or Christian. We didn't celebrate Christian holidays or anything like that. But there was not a high level of attention to Jewish ideas and the Jewish calendar in my home. And similarly with Israel, my parents were not anti-Israel, far from it. But neither were we, proudly Zionist, paying a careful attention to Israel. Israel was not usually part of my family's dinner table conversation. It just wasn't on the mind. We were fully American Jews, but completely integrated into the American community that I grew up in. I got interested in Judaism a little later.
Wait, you went to Jewish schools?
I went to public school the whole time. I suffered through these horrible Sunday school and Hebrew school where I learned nothing. Just for reference, I had a bar mitzvah at which, I memorized the tape from the cantor, not knowing a single letter of what I was even saying. And that's typical of Reform Jewry of that time, and maybe of this time too. I don't know. But what was dignified about my Jewish experience and my Jewish identity was the fact that my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, who lived close to us, was a survivor. And that was important, and everyone understood that was important, and I intuited that was important, without fully understanding the complexity of what his life meant at that time. But that planted a seed. That was a marker of something that's worthy of something reverential, because it's so out of the ordinary. And when he survived, he made his way to Canada, and from Canada met my grandmother, and they made a home in Western New York in the United States. So that's my earliest Jewish story. But the turn for me came a few years later when in university I got really interested in studying political ideas and Greek philosophy in particular, ancient Greek philosophy. And at that time, it seemed to me that the most important, most interesting, most impressive commentator on Greek philosophy was a guy named Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss wrote penetrating commentary on the works of Plato and Thucydides and Aristotle, and also this guy that I never heard of before, Maimonides. And it seemed like if this commentator, who was so wise and such a penetrating reader of Aristotle, also thought that this Jewy Jew, some rabbi I never heard of before, was worth the same level of care and scrutiny, then maybe there was something in Judaism that I hadn't gotten from my early synagogue and worth investigating.
So just to jump in here, Maimonides would be maybe a foreign name to someone we heard about. That's Rambam. Rambam is Maimonides.
Right. So Rabbi
my
Moshe,
Hebrew-speaking friends may have not heard.
Nachon.
the name.
Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon is in Greek and then in English called Maimonides. So Rambam, who is famous for trying to integrate the insights of Aristotelian science, Aristotelian philosophy, and Chazal and Torah and the tradition of rabbinic ideas that he had inherited and had become a master of. And so that project, the looking at both of these sources of wisdom and seeing the ways in which they could be integrated and that each could learn from the other or enhance the other, was a big Maimonides project, and that was something that intrigued me when I was in college.
There's a proverbial saying that between Athens and Jerusalem, so that's Rambam's life work. That's what you're saying.
Exactly right. And it just so happened that I felt like after college, I felt that I had been laboring in the salt mines of Athens for the past many years, and I was so naive. I wanted to know what was Jerusalem all about. And so I just decided to move to Jerusalem. Like literally, I found a master's program at Hebrew University. I went to Jerusalem without knowing as I said before, a single letter of Hebrew. And I just wanted to throw myself into that world and see what it was like. And that was a hugely important experience for me. I got to read a lot and study with great professors there. But the most important thing that happened to me during those years in Jerusalem happened when I walked into a bookstore in Jerusalem on Shlom Zion HaMalka. There's an English language bookstore, and on the wall of the store was an English language periodical I never heard of before called Azure. And the front cover of Azure had an article by a man that I never heard of before, some guy called Yoram Chazoni. And there is an article that he wrote subtitled Why Hobbes Learned Hebrew, as a reference to Thomas Hobbes, the Enlightenment philosopher, whose great work, The Leviathan, published in 1651, was important for modern liberalism, and that this guy, who I had studied in college, should have learned Hebrew. I never heard about any of that. So I picked up this periodical from the shelf, and I started reading this essay, and it seemed to me preposterously wrong. Like everything about it, everything I had been taught to think about Thomas Hobbes was wrong. And so I looked on the back, and it turns out that this magazine was published by some place called the Shalem Center. And again, like completely naive, I just walked over to the address of the Shalem Center and knocked on the door. And I said, is this guy Yoram Hazoni here? Can I talk to him? Like thinking that I'm going to set him straight. And that began an exposure to the scholars and thinkers and writers in those years at the Shalem Center, which was hugely valuable for helping me think about the best of the humanistic and Western tradition with Jewish ideas and Jewish texts.
You were able to meet Yoram Chazoni that day?
So I mean, I was like some kid, you know. I walked in, but no. The answer is no. I didn't meet him that day, but I met a colleague of his, and got to meet many colleagues of his, and eventually got to meet him, and it began an exposure to a taste in thinking that I've tried to. Now I don't. No one should agree with all the conclusions of all these people. That's not my point. But it exposed me to a taste in thinking that I've tried to live up to ever since.
All right. So fast forward. Today you're a senior director at the Tikva Fund, which is based in around Washington, D.C., right? And has its... I'm sorry?
So Tikva is based in New York and in Jerusalem.
All right. Sorry.
I happen to live outside of Washington, D.C., but I don't live at the center of Tikva.
All right, I'm sorry. So I meant that its origins are in the U.S. That's what I meant, and it has a lot of important work that it does, or it aims at its work, or a big portion of its work towards Israel, and it has the Israeli branch in Jerusalem, and you are there as a senior director. So if I imagine all the backstory you gave, this is a summed up explanation of what appealed, what brought you there, what paved the road towards something like the Tikva Fund. But if you can describe the Tikva Fund better than I can, I would love.
So Tikva, it's a great question. Tikva is an ideas institution, a combination of an educational institution, a think tank, a publisher. And Tikva is politically Zionist, economically free market oriented, culturally traditional, and theologically completely open-minded. And we go about our work in a couple of different big areas of endeavor. Tikva runs educational programs. Tikva has programs that organize people around a set of ideas. And Tikva is also a publisher. Tikva in the United States publishes, along with our friends at Princeton University Press, an academic book series, a quarterly review of books, and a daily web magazine, Mosaic. So Tikva is doing a lot of different things, but the idea of Tikva is to see if one institution can hold together both the spirit of liberal arts and liberal learning, in which we try to expose students to master teachers and great texts and help them follow the argument wherever it leads, to help them think a little more clearly, at the one hand. And on the other hand, there are some things that we actually do believe in, and some ideas that we boldly want to stand for in the public square, where the debate is not open to question, but we actually care about some principles that we think serve the Jewish people and the Jewish community in the United States and in Israel. And on those issues, we try to organize people around the ideas we care about.
All right. And would you agree with me that it's safe to say that the Tikva Fund barged into an open door, or I'll phrase it differently, it filled a hole that of intellectualism and foundations for thought that was not there in Israel, at least on with your political leanings or liberal values. Tikva Fund was a first, or somewhat first, in the Israeli public sphere.
I mean, the truth is, I think my colleagues in Israel are doing important things, but my own work is mostly focused in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that even they would say that they're completely starting from a blank page. After all, the institution that I was describing earlier, the Shalem Center, is a kind of predecessor for some of Tikva's work, but it's very different. I think one key difference is that the staff and all of them, the staff and the faculty and the writers who are working out of the Israel office are all Israelis, and therefore they're thinking about questions and thinking about problems, both in the more public policy side of their work and in the more educational side of their work, that are accommodated to the particular needs and questions of the Israeli public sphere.
All right. Okay, so we talked about, before we started recording, how can I describe the topic that I want to talk to you? And I think we'll chip away during this conversation, and it should be very interesting. But if I want to give it a word, or a word that would describe what is interesting to me in this talk, is identity, right? But that's not good enough. So let's try to drill down to what is interesting. And I specifically want to talk about this tension. Maybe it's not tension in your experience, but from the outside, as an Israeli in the U.S., it seems to me there's a tension for Israeli Jews, Israeli Jews that have Israel as either a thorn in their side or as an aspirational, romanticizing what is Israel. It's so nice, startup nation, they're so good there, something like that. And the background to it, or the environment to it, is that American Jewry has been historically attacked from either side of the political aisle for its relations with Israel. Things change, right? Support for Israel and lack of support between Democrats, Republicans. It all keeps, it's a sort of a not constant. Throughout the last, let's say, 100 years, it's been a wavy road a little bit. So I think that this tension that American Jews have would be very interesting to try to drill down to.
So let me start from a slightly different place.
Okay.
The first thing that I want to just say, related to contemporary politics and the U.S.-Israel relationship, is something that I want to, whenever I have a chance to explain this to my Israeli friends. Sometimes Israelis are very attuned to this, and sometimes they're not. So I always want to take the opportunity to say that the U.S.-Israel relationship doesn't have that much to do with American Jewry. We American Jews see the U.S.-Israel relationship through our own point of view, and we think it's really important that we play an outsized role in that relationship. But in point of fact, think of it this way. most congressional districts in America do not have Jews in them.
Yeah.
But those members of Congress love Israel and support Israel. That is still, certainly in Congress, that is still more bipartisan than not. Now that's shifting. You're right that there are some worrying trends about that. But it's actually Christian philo-Semitism and Christian Zionism that's more responsible, in my view, for the U.S.-Israel relationship than the American Jewish community.
I completely agree, and it's interesting to discuss that. But I want to explain myself maybe a little bit better. Let's imagine the average secular Jewish that went to Hebrew school on Sunday, as you mentioned, and an experience similar to yours. But a lot of the times, they grew up with maybe not strong feelings or towards Israel, maybe not involvement and listening to every bit of news that's about Israel. But Israel they have a romantic image, perhaps, of Israel, right? Very naive, perhaps. And then they get to somewhere like college, and in college they hear, actually, and that's in a lot of campuses, it'll be, I'll generalize, but it's true, I guess, more often than not. They get that, no, the romanticizing of Israel is untrue because Israel is actually a devil, demonizing Israel. So now there's a huge flip, or maybe a need for that average Jew to redeem, maybe, and prove that they're not on that side. That's the wrong side. And we see a lot. So you said it right. The support for Israel is coming from the Christian elements in American society. But the Jewish part has a very polarized, the Jewish community, if there's such a thing, have a very polarized perception of Israel and activism towards Israel.
So I see. So Shaka, I see it a little differently.
Yeah.
I think the experience that you're describing of entering into the campus setting with an idealized, romanticized, warm feeling of Israel, and then getting mugged by reality and learning that actually Israel's like the oppressor, colonialist, and violent, and war criminal, and all that. That experience, I think, it certainly can happen for people who grew up like I did. But actually, that to me more describes someone who grew up a little more, more in the conservative or Orthodox movement than the way that I grew up. The kind of casual, ignorance, warm feeling ignorance about Israel that I had when I was young, there's actually a very old American tradition. The problem with the American Jewish community's Zionism is that it's weak compared to other diaspora communities. Let me just to root this discussion in some history. My friend Rick Richmond wrote a terrific book about this. In the year 1940, Zev Jabotinsky and David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann all made separate trips to the United States in order to raise a Jewish army to fight Hitler. And all of them failed. They came to American Jewry and gave a bunch of speeches, and American Jewry basically shrugged its shoulders. I mean, that's to exaggerate a little, but not that much. Why? Because we had arrived in the golden, in the golden land, and what do we need? What we just escaped? We just clawed our way out of the old world. What, we want to go back to the old world now? It's crazy. So I think the kind of the setting for the American Zionism, the Jewish Zionism in America that you're talking about, I think exploded not until the 6-Day War. So after 1967, when Israel was like, wow, this little country might actually make it, and by the way, they'd also because of the battlefield heroism of the Six-Day War, they also inspired a kind of equivalent heroism, or the possibility of heroism, in American Jewry. That's, I think, when a lot of the Zionist stuff started. And Jews could start walking down the street proudly wearing a kippah in the street. And, you know, it wasn't so weird to make Aliyah after that. But before that, I mean, there's quite a few years in which in which American Jewish Zionism was pretty weak. Anyhow, so that's just by way of historical background.
All right, there are even these stories of trying to found a Jewish state somewhere. Can't remember exactly where, but somewhere in New York. I need to research that.
But this is an amazing story. This is the island of Ararat, right, which was an experiment pioneered by Mordechai Emanuel Noah, who has an impressive public career. Was, I think, President Monroe's emissary to Tunis, and, you know, had come back to the United States and was going to try to found this proto-Zionist settlement outside of Buffalo, New York. And here too, you know, like, he had gotten all these famous, eminent American dignitaries to support it, and then when he actually founded this place, like, no Jews showed up.
Yeah, it's I had a friend that his ancestors were there to blow up the first the Jewish Congress where Herzl was bringing the Uganda plan. His grandfather or great grandfather was there to blow it all up, not literally, right? To just protest and make sure the offer does not pass. And it resonates with what you just described. Maybe a lack of understanding of, I'll say bluntly, what is Zionism, right? It's not just a Jewish state, but it has a grounding somewhere, right? And that would be probably Zion. And there was another, going into a tangent, one of the educational programs that I went through, one of the instructors, there's a whole group, it's in Israel, right? There's a whole group, and the instructor is giving a scenario, saying, all right, it's 5 years in the future, and fighting in the Middle East continues, and delegitimizing, and Gaza, and Lebanon, and blah, 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 blah. Things are hard, right? And the UN comes to a resolution. Australia sees the potential of having a Jewish state, startup nation close by, and offers a territory in Australia, right? That's 5 times the size of Israel, much more fruitful ground. We'll make the arrangements. Everything will be great. And we'll call it New Israel. That's the UN proposal. Do you take it or do you not take it? And that's just as a thought exercise to the class, and then debate that. And I was rather shocked that half of the class, and these are I will say high status people. Okay, I'll say that in Israeli society, half of them said we should do it. We should take it. And, we can talk about it if you want, but it's hard to explain the case of why not to take it, because the case is, for me, you don't understand that you're a link in a chain, right? You have your ancestors and your descendants, and you're about to break the chain in some way. And this is just a caricature of my opinion about this, but I think it just explains it in one sentence, even though my opinion on this is a lot more complex. But you have a sort of pact between generations, and you're dooming, quote unquote, your descendants for yearning to Zion has happened for 2,000 years. You just don't realize it. And am I right? I'm not sure, but as long as the Jewish identity will hold, and we can talk about that in a second, as long as it will hold, then you're condemning them for that yearning.
Those descendants and those ancestors who came before you prayed 3 times a day for Jerusalem, and feel, or at least said, that reaffirmed by the act of prayer and by the way they lived their lives, that they were living in fidelity to a covenant with the creator of the universe, who had given them that land. And if one were to try, and there have been many experiments to try to do this, but if one were to try to sever the Jewish tradition from its deepest religious roots, then it makes it a lot harder for you to expect your descendants to live as your ancestors lived.
All right, so I'm for someone who hears this and doesn't know, I'm completely secular. And what you did here is you smuggled in the creator of the universe, and it's something that I don't think is necessary. Right? It may be necessary. Maybe if you press me to it, and you'll say, so why do you yearn for this land, and why you and not someone else? Why not? So. I think I can make the case without the creator of the universe, and I understand that a lot of people that would be the basic cause for why this yearning exists. But do you think that without the creator of the universe, it has any weight?
Well, listen, the fact that for these past many thousands of years, Jews have been living as if it was promised to them, itself has weight, in my view. But
I agree.
But if you were to say, that to press me too, then yes, I think that it's impossible. That I think that a purely political Zionism, which wants to just say, it doesn't matter. It could be Uganda. It could be Australia. It could be Ararat outside of Buffalo, New York. It just has to be some place. Is not itself a compelling reason for our children to remain in that place or to want to invest their spiritual energy in that place.
So I'll try to counter my argument. I say it has to be Israel, right? It has to be Zion, but you don't have to have a creator of the universe. And that's because of history. You have a line, you were there, and because my ancestors believed it's the creator of the universe, whatever. I don't care that's what they believed, but they were yearning for that place. And the reason that they had may be true, may be untrue. But, all right, so I have the force of history, right? Not the creator, but history. And that pact between generations. But the counter argument to me would be, all right, so basically you're saying if you're going to be strong enough, then you're going to take it, what you think is yours, from people who live there, right? So it's sort of fascism. Maybe fascism is not right, but you have a right to that land because you have a bigger sword. Because if you ignore the creator of the universe, then all that matters is the size of your sword. And to counter that, or to say that it's not just because my sword is is big, then only the creator of the universe can fix that for you.
Yeah, there I think the argument of history is more powerful. Except just to say, I'll just say in the beginning what I want to come back to in the end, which is that though the argument of history is more powerful, the argument of history is authorized by the creator of the universe, who established a unique covenant with the Jewish people, with the children of Abraham. But why do I say that the argument of history is more powerful? It's not just that might makes right, and just so the Jews could force their way into the Ottoman Empire and establish themselves. I don't think that's a compelling story, and it's not the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter, as I see it, is that an ancient people, the Jewish people, came into itself and acquired its nationality. It focused on the land of Israel as it was entering into the land of Israel, and then lived there. The temple stood for 1,000 years. Like, what are we talking about? The Jewish people governed and lived as a nation in the land of Israel, was forcibly exiled by imperial powers several times, and never stopped over these last many thousands of years praying to return, and eventually merited the possibility to return. It seems to me that history is the core argument, but that history is only made intelligible by the fact that the Jewish people remained a distinct people, even though they were in the diaspora for these many years. And the thing that explains that, it seems to me, is a chosenness which is beyond full comprehension by unassisted human reason.
Yeah, they say that more than the Jews kept the Shabbat kept the Jews.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. It's an interesting discussion whether power of history is enough, or you need that creator in there to at the base level justify the power of history, right? If you peel deep enough, do you need that or not? It's interesting. I hope I don't need it, but maybe someone can press me and say you're actually arguing for might makes right.
But I would say something. I would say something more, which is maybe a particular person, they are just not made for prayer, and they don't. It's hard for them to it's hard for them to think religiously and feel religiously, and it's hard for them to be religious. And look, that is a human type that is a type of person that all of us know, and maybe you are that way. But I think it's good for your family if you try to live a little more religiously than you really believe. Because first of all, it can help awaken things in you and allow you to grow religiously yourself. But it also holds forth a possibility for your children who may not be like you, who may need the consolation of faith and the inspiration of religion in a way that you, for some reason, you don't think you do, or you don't, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting. The one thing that I've been, contemplating is taking the weekend off from electronics, right? Or at least the day. And you can think about it. Yeah, Jews had that for a while now. It's called Shabbat. So not from a religious reason, but just suddenly that wisdom of Shabbat, with all its faults, right? Because I think there are faults to it because the world changed and Shabbat plays games. Some of the rules are playing games with what Shabbat is. But that basic wisdom of taking a day off and detaching, that is something that I'm entertaining and never thought I would. So that's interesting.
So, but Shaka, now I want to take this part of the conversation and relate back to the original question that you posed.
Yeah, let's go back there.
So let's say
Good side tangent. So
let's say that that there is such a person in America who for a variety of reasons, who for a variety of reasons isn't comfortable being religious. So, but they don't. But that person doesn't want to be completely devoid of they don't want to sever their Jewish identity from themselves completely. They want to be Jewish, but they can't be religious. So, especially after the 6-Day War, a new option made itself available. They could connect to their Judaism and connect to the Jewish identity by being a Zionist. And that is one of the places that provided a new option. That kind of Jewish nationalism provided a new option so that you could love Israel and pay attention to the news of Israel and buy Israeli stuff and eventually watch Fauda and all of that, and you could try to make that substitute for being a religious Jew. I don't think that ultimately that's a sufficient substitute. But what I want to just say is that the insight of a person who says, "Listen, the religion thing is hard for me." Many of them, that's where many of them go if they want to remain Jewish.
All right, that's interesting. So it's I do see that definitely, that Israel is a substitute, or it's a filler to maybe it makes you feel good about that identity complex that I think exists in some way, and it's interesting. But is it strong enough? Because we know, or we see some data that in a few generations the Jewish population will probably be a lot smaller here, right? People consider themselves Jewish, and maybe that connection through Israel or through a title of Zionist, maybe that's not enough. Zionist American, right, or supporter of Zionism. Maybe that's not strong enough. So I'll try to take it back and say, all right, so you have that Jewish population here that's trying to act towards Israel in a way that will fulfill some of their identity needs. And that may be in fighting Israel politically, I think. That's my interpretation. The people that attack Israeli policy the most, a lot of them are Jews. And I would analyze it that it's a part of that trying to fulfill their Jewish, tikkun olam and all that. Because of their Jewish identity, they would be fiercer. And their activism would be more, hotter than
Right.
it would otherwise be, or as a supporter, the adopt a soldier and send your kids and
Right.
and buy kafé names osem and all that, right? So
That, by the way, it's disgusting. Why would anyone possibly do that? But yes, I know the type of person you're talking about.
yeah. Hi, Grandma. I'm kidding. So do you? Can you see it like I'm describing it as
Shachar, can I just tell you though that the years I was in Israel in 2005 to 2007 is when I was living in Jerusalem, and it was a very important time right after Hitnatkut, right after disengagement from Gaza. There's a huge amount of interesting, important things happening. The Lebanon War. There's a lot of things were happening in those years, but in the culture of Israel, it was at the tail end of a coffee revolution, where people who had come to Israel before used to drink this completely disgusting boats or Nescafe, and it was all of that.
Nescafe is the original sin. Bots is good, but
Okay,
Café Shachor is good. But,
but then you go back and by the time I got there, unless the espresso was made on this fancy Italian machine, it was what am I, a farmer? I'm not drinking this disgusting. All of a sudden, Israelis became coffee snobs in those years.
Yeah, and Americans have yet to make the move with filtered coffee. But all right, so we talked about that identity complex. Can you relate to my analysis there? That's very much an interpretation that that identity complex, and as you described it, as Israel as something that allows people to fulfill some of those. Yeah.
So listen, I think the first thing to say is that it doesn't need to be this way, and we're speaking somewhat in abstractions in order to try to be clear and talk about things that are real. But of course, every individual's life is a little more complex, and so we're kind of talking in abstractions on purpose. So all of the Hebrew speaking and English speaking listeners, this doesn't describe any single person's life, but you can try to think in these categories. And the first category I'd say is that there are a great many religious Zionists who are perhaps now the most who are now perhaps the largest number of American Zionists tend to be religious. There's a revolution happening in the Haredi world, which is becoming more the American Haredi world. I mean, which is becoming more Zionist in ways that they were not before. The people I'm talking about would not necessarily embrace the term Zionism, but never mind the term. It would get too into the weeds. They embrace the reality and importance of a Jewish state.
So that is a process that you see in the last couple of decades,
yes,
or
yes, yeah, in the last years. But what we're talking about now are people who are not that. So the people who send their who go to a Orthodox day school and then spend a gap year in Israel and then go to Yeshiva University. That is not the type of people we're talking about now. Now we're talking about the people who tend to be a little less observant, who tend to be secular, and either have allowed Israel to form their identity negatively by being extremely critical of Israel, or it forms their identity positively by embracing Israel as a secular replacement for religion. I think both of those do fill a felt need in the lives of the people who adopt them, but they are not. They don't have anywhere near the civilizational force of the religious attachment, or the combination of religious and political and cultural attachment to Israel, because it's very hard to pass those kinds of political commitments on to children. And it's not part of a civilization. It's not part. It doesn't provide the necessary richness for tradition. It's just something that you are passionate about, and it will die when you die.
So I just thought about, as you were talking, I just thought about how to phrase the thing that's on my mind. The U.S., America, it's a very unique country in the fact that it doesn't rely. Its principles, right? Its foundation doesn't rely on a joint history, but on a joint future. Okay, you subscribe to those ideals, and you can become American. That's pretty unique. Perhaps Australia has something similar. I got to say, I don't know foundational documents in the formation of Australia all too well, but I think you can become Australian as well. But other than the U.S., it doesn't happen anywhere, right? Maybe some people want it to happen, but it doesn't. Okay, and in Israel it doesn't happen as well. In Israel also, it's a one country with two people there, right? With someone who's Jewish and someone who's Arab or Muslim or whatever. And in the U.S. you can become American, and it's not only unique. I think it's also very demanding, because you need to subscribe to those ideals and to those principles in a way day after day. Once you unsubscribe, then you should get out of here, or maybe the country has changed, then it's no longer what you subscribed for, right? So it's very demanding, and to be honest, I think it's really challenged in this time, and we don't have to get into that. We can talk about it in generalizations if you want, but I think that those principles, at a time of everyone has reach through social media, those ideals are really tested in the coming decade or so, maybe even shorter than that. And that the amount of that demand, or the magnitude of that demand, I think overlaps, or I don't know if cancels, but it takes away from the demand to stay Jewish as you defined it, the religion, whereas we defined it, the pact between generations, and maybe give that religious angle and all that. And Israel is my way to express my Judaism, or to stay with the sensation of being Jewish, right? So I think it's again, looking from the outside, it looks like a collision of attention span or a collision of what you're obligated to more. What do you subscribe to more? These ideals or your history? You know?
This is a big important subject.
All right.
First of all, I don't think that it's really fully correct to say that America is a set of ideals alone. And it's not like usually when people think about this, they say, well, France is a nation because it's always been France and it's based on a shared history. And America is different because America is based on ideals that in principle, anyone from Afghanistan to Peru could become an American by believing in those ideals. I think that creedal understanding is true, but it is no less true that America is now a nation of a shared history and common memory, and and Americans are in part formed as much by their history as they are by their aspirations for the future. Americans are Americans because when Russian Ashkenazi immigrants came to the United States, they learned to think of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln as theirs somehow, as forming them, and once they were acculturated into that history, that's part of what made them Americans. So yes, I agree with you that one has to assent to a certain kind of ideas about the purpose of government and the purpose of government and the natural rights teaching of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's all true, but no less is history important for American nationalism and American patriotism. Okay, but now the question is, how does all that stuff relate to one's Zionism and one's Jewish commitments? And aren't these two rival civilizations that somehow impose a priority one on the other, and you have to choose? That's the big question. And I think here the answer is the answer enters into the heart of what makes America exceptional, and why that antinomy, which is true in other places, is not true here. The reason it's not true here is because the American moral imagination was formed by Hebraic ideas and Hebraic stories. And when the earliest Americans thought about what they were doing, they thought that they were fleeing oppression and crossing a wilderness and coming into a providential land where they could live freely under the law. That's what they thought they were doing. That's what the Pilgrims thought that they were doing, and that's what many of the founders thought that they were doing, and that's what African-American slaves thought that they were doing. That is a recurrent theme of the way that Americans understand themselves. And that means that for religious Jews who can be accepted fully as equal citizens in the United States, that they're bringing their particular religious commitments only strengthens that Hebraic strain in America, which is very deep in the United States.
You're talking about the fact that there are dozens of Jerusalems and dozens of Bethels. They saw this as the new promised land because,
So when you drive around New England, you cannot go very far without driving through New Canaan and Jericho, and exactly for that reason, that they thought that they were recreating the archetypical political story that lived in their heart, which was the Hebraic story.
Okay, but now the Orthodox Jew that lives in the same New England, right? He feels connected to that land because of that. That's your argument. They would feel connected to that land because of the history of the foundation of that colony, those colonies in New England.
I think that the Orthodox Jew who lives in Massachusetts today, or lives in the United States today, no, it would be facile to imagine that a person lives where they live because of the founding myths and founding stories of that place. That's not why a person lives where they live. So I love Israel as much, I love Israel as much as any American can love Israel. Okay. So why do I live in America? And the reason I live in America is because one does not start one's life with a blank slate. I was born into America.
Yeah.
My parents were born in America, or my mother was born in Canada. She came to it. My parents were formed in America and lived their lives in America, and so I'm an American for for that reason. When my grandfather was to go back to an earlier moment in our conversation, my grandfather was fleeing Europe after the war and had no other place to go. He came to North America, and so that's how my family, the destiny of my family put me in this place, and I'm formed by that American tradition, and I love America. I mean, it is the only appropriate sentiment, I think, for a person formed the way that I was formed to have is gratitude for the country. And by the way, one should say, for religious Jews who are living in the United States today, there are plenty of reasons to worry about anti-Semitism from the right and anti-Semitism from the left and anti-Semitism everywhere. And I do not trivialize those worries for even 1 second. Nevertheless, American Jewry is in still perhaps the most blessed diaspora that any diaspora community has ever enjoyed. American Jews can go to Costco and get kosher pastrami from Costco. Like, this is a different kind of it seems to us now a different kind of diaspora, and we have a responsibility to try to keep it that way. It will not stay that way automatically, but we have a chance to keep it that way, and that means that we Jews who do live in the United States can enjoy the blessings of freedom that America affords its citizens only to the extent that we participate in it and keep it that way.
So let me ask you this. I don't have data about this. Maybe I can pull this up later. But a hypothesis, would maybe Jews donate and are involved in their community or in where they live with Jewish institutions? Or is it for the general population? If I'm donating something as a Jewish family, it's probably for the JCC, and that Hebrew school, and to Israel, right?
Okay, so
and I don't have any data about this, but it's just a
okay.
hypothesis.
But let's entertain this hypothesis, and I think that the core claim, the core argument that stands underneath the hypothesis is that, fine, you can live in America, but you're still going to be in your little shtetl. So
you're nurturing your shtetl, right? You're saying, hey, I need the shtetl to last a few more generations, right? Otherwise, the shtetl doesn't stay, and there's my great grandchildren will not be Jewish, so I need to make sure that
So listen, that
the line holds.
That worry is certainly an understandable worry, and no Jewish parent living in the United States can escape that worry. And that's one of the things that Israel offers, I think, that America does not offer. Because, see, you said earlier, Shaka, that you see yourself as a secular person. So even a secular person who grows up in Tel Aviv, in the most secular of all secular places, that person still speaks the language of the prophets. And their calendar, the public calendar, is a calendar in which even the secular person does not work on Yom Kippur. And the architecture of life is a Jewish architecture, even though you're secular. And that's not true in America.
So I'm secular, and I'm very much Jewish. That's part of, I feel that pact across generations. And I think that being Israeli, and I'm in the U.S. right now, but plan to move back pretty soon. I have a get out of jail free card, right? I am a strand of Judaism, which is called Israeli, right? And everything you said is true. So that's why I'm very confident about my kids in that sense.
Yeah, so
right?
American Jews don't have that. American Jews who do not make Aliyah, who do not become Israeli, don't have that luxury. But still, I want to go back to the and so we have that worry. We have the worry that you started with, which is the worry that makes some people say we have to live in a shtetl of some kind. Okay, Now I want to just go back and respond to that challenge, though.
Yeah.
And the first thing I would say is that one could drive on the campus of basically any university, or go to any museum, or any many hospitals in the United States, hospitals that serve Jews and non-Jews of every variety, and they'll go to the Schwartz Cancer Ward because it was endowed by some wealthy Jewish family. That's the case for libraries and concert halls across the country. It's certainly not the case that the tradition of Jewish philanthropy in America is exclusively to Jewish institutions. However, we shouldn't be nervous, and we shouldn't be ashamed when Jews do want to strengthen Jewish institutions. And
by the way, I'm not criticizing it. I'm trying to wrap my head around what I'm seeing.
But
right?
there's a very deep insight here, because I think when Jews strengthen Jewish institutions, when they do that philanthropically, when they do that with their work, when they send their kids to those institutions, when they participate in those institutions, I don't see that as a retreat from the American public square. I don't. In fact, I see it as one way to strengthen the American public square. This gets back to why America is an exceptional place. America does not ask Jews to check their Judaism at the door in order to fully participate in the United States. It doesn't. And I had the experience. So we do send our kids to a Jewish day school. We had the experience of in pre-COVID times of going to an assembly at the lower school, at the elementary school, in which all of these little boys wearing kippot are singing American songs and repeating from memory American poetry and doing these little American dances. Okay, but the point is that it is a religious institution, this private Jewish day school, which is forming them as American citizens, which is acculturating them, as we were speaking about before, so that they embrace Abraham Lincoln and George Washington as their own history. And now my challenge would be to ask the question, at the public schools down the block, were there the same kind of attention and fidelity to American traditions as there were in this religious private school? And I don't know the answer to that. I send my kids to this school, so I only know what happens in this school. But I know that the public schools that I went to were very, were very. They were all nervous about American patriotism. Already when I was in school, the intellectual trend was already to undermine American patriotism by showing how all of the heroes of American history were actually villains, and et cetera. Yeah. So my point is that at Bible academies and Catholic schools and yeshivot and Jewish day schools across the country, American citizens are being formed in the most robust American way, and I think that's part of what makes America exceptional.
That's great. So I have things popping up to my mind. Let's say, again, thought exercise. Let's say that I'm talking about Orthodox religious Jews, American religious Jews that have all that Americanism, nurtured in them from a young age, which is, it's not criticism, very positive in my opinion. But now let's say it's proven that the Messiah has come, right? Which I don't know exactly what would that mean, but let's say that American identity is now in serious battle with their religious obligation, maybe to come to Israel. And I know it's a populist question. It's not taking it to extreme, but I'm trying to refine something out of that extreme situation. What do you think? That it sits on the same on the very same place of their being, no, of their identity.
I don't know. I guess I don't really know how to answer that question. If the Messiah were to come, and it were,
By the way, Israel may have been the Messiah 70 something years ago, right? Some people may interpret it that way.
True. Some people interpret it that way. If the Messiah were to come, and it were necessary for Jews to gather in the land of Israel, then Jews should gather in the land of Israel. But I don't.
That's settled. All right.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to preoccupy myself with counting the minutes until the Messiah comes.
Yeah. All right. So I'll ask a question or talk about something that resonates with that, but not in such unfruitful way. When I first moved to the U.S., I saw myself. I'm not American. I love America, right? But I'm not American. I have a connection to it. I have a family connection to it as well. I see the importance of America to me as a person and as an Israeli, right? We look up to America. I do. And I found myself here not caring about not caring as much as I used to about people around me. And I felt, and I may have felt that I'm not the only one. Let me explain. In Israel, I would volunteer, teaching kids to do that. I would go and give classes there. I would, very much involved in my community, and not close to home even. I would go to the places that have it rough, and I would volunteer there. And here I'm not even, I wasn't even considering it. And my analysis on my state of mind was, and I may have projected it to people around me. I said, all right, in Israel, I felt like I'm a part of the project. We still need the project to succeed. The project is ongoing. And here it seems to me like project a success. Let's enjoy the fruits of it, right? And maybe that sensation of success, let's enjoy it, is something that Jews here with that identity complex that may exist, and they're enjoying the fruits of it, and having Israel as some substitute for a deeper need, right, or that involvement need. And it resonates with me with the story you told about Ben Gurion and Weizmann and all that don't involve us in that project all too much, right? We're now enjoying the fruits of this project that is good. Don't interrupt here. I don't know if I'm throwing a curveball at you too much, but
no. This is a really important question, because there is a worry, there is an anxiety abroad in the land, in the United States, and throughout the West, throughout Western Europe too, that the tremendous gains in prosperity, material prosperity, commercial prosperity, economic prosperity, has also come at a cost to our spiritual lives, to our aesthetic lives, to the moral fiber of the United States. And I think that one need not see those in tension, but in this case, I do think that they're in tension. And the trouble is that that material success, that economic prosperity, is absolutely essential. It's one should not trivialize that either and downplay the importance of that. Certainly in the Israeli context, but no less in the American context. But in the Israeli context, if you don't have economic success, you can't afford that fancy, nice military that you have. And if you can't afford that fancy, nice military that you have, it's going to be hard to defend your borders from your enemies. And I think the same is true of the United States. Not only the life of the nation, but in the life of families as well. The economic success is hugely important. But we have to recognize that there's a trade-off. It does come at the expense of a different kind of impoverishment. And that impoverishment does have to do with the communitarian ethic or the sociability that you're talking about. Volunteering is one way to see that. Of course, one can see it in other ways too. But this, it strikes me, this is why America needs people formed in religious subcommunities. Because people formed in religious subcommunities can re-inject and therefore renew and revitalize this thing that America is currently lacking.
So the argument, if I'm trying to understand and expand it a little bit, that secularism can work on the individual level, but on the population level and societal level, you need those cells of religious communities that can, thread, keep a thread throughout society, keep that connection or that
I think
that resolve about your right, or your you have a right to be here.
Listen, America is so vast that it's not natural to feel that my fellow citizen in another state, in another part of the country, on another coast, is part of the same project that I'm also a part of as an American. That's not true in Israel. In Israel, one serves in national service, either in the military or not in the. One serves the nation, and that forms you as a part of a thing. And the scale of Israel is so much smaller that it's easier to feel a robust sense of citizenship in that kind of environment than it is in America. And so, the construction of the American regime, of American government, is just very different. It did not make the claim that it would work on our hearts the same way. And the thing that attaches Americans to their neighbors is not necessarily American government. It's voluntary associations that are often rooted, they don't need to be rooted in a religious subcommunity, though that has traditionally been the way that Americans mediated their work up through different levels of society. It was traditionally through religious valence, but it doesn't need to be. But it was those non-governmental, non-political mediating institutions that connected Americans to one another. And without those, America just doesn't work. It's not made to work without them.
Yeah, I completely resonates with me. So I have another observation or hypothesis. You mentioned that America is struggling right now with the project, right? Or was the project righteous? Sorry. Or maybe we start doubting our founding fathers and the history, 1619 project and stuff like that. And you see it across the West, actually. And I'm sure you may have read Douglas Murray's book, The Strange Death of Europe, which we recommended here, which is, jaw-dropping. And I remember a conversation I had with my cousin a decade ago. And I felt that the thing that Douglas Murray put his finger on so eloquently and so elegantly, I've been feeling it, and I think I've been feeling it because I'm Israeli 2 decades ago, right? Maybe a decade and a half. Because Israel was the first one to get that lack of resolve from its allies, right? Or Israel was the first one to be deemed unrighteous, right? All right, it was in colleges, it was in policy maybe, but it trickled down or trickled up to policy and everything. So I saw this coming. I'm not going to say that I was a prophet, that I knew how it's going to manifest, but it's not surprising. And for for people that are not from Israel, I think it just hit them in the face 6-7 years ago. And since then, I would argue has gotten worse. But a decade ago, I had a chat with my cousin. He's American, and we're talking about a lot of things, geopolitics. A parliament. You know the term parlement, when you sit with your friends in a coffee shop and discussing geopolitics as if you know something. And we were talking about a lot of things, and he asked me, so generally, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And I told him something like, I'm pessimistic for the West, but optimistic for Israel, which is actually being pessimistic for Israel as well, right? But I see that in Israel, there's something that holds that. There are a lot of challenges and societal challenges, and a lot of people maybe that listen to this will say society is falling apart in Israel as well, but I would argue that it's not close. The challenges, societal challenges that are happening there, as opposed to here. Here it's much worse. And looking from afar, it looks like in Europe it's more similar to here than what's happening in Israel. And Yoram Hazony has good explanations to it. Maybe you had chats with him about it and you would like to describe it. But one of the things that I put my finger on back then, 10 years ago, is that the fact that the Palestinians need Zionism to define themselves as a people, but in some way we need them to not go down that slippery slope of not feeling righteous, because they are in our face in a good or in a bad way, mostly bad. But it's a challenge that we have to stick together, right? And Palestinians, or in general the enemies of Israel, there are many geopolitical and real life-threatening challenges that Israel faces, and Germany doesn't, and the U.S. doesn't. I mean, at least on the face of it. So in a way, I think that us versus them feeling of a society is something that's missing in the West, and that prosperity that you mentioned, the material prosperity, makes that or is a component in losing the plot line of saying that we need to stick together. And when you don't have that external enemy, then it's starting to fall apart.
External enemies, for sure, help a society feel solidarity. That's definitely true, that when one is threatened, it's easier to feel solidarity internally. And America had that for a very brief moment after 9/11. But we're not constituted the same way that Israel is in that regard.
But remember that America, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, America had it almost across its entire history. All right, the 19th century, it's not the same one, but 20th century, there was an external threat, right? People talk about the 20s that were wild. Maybe that's the only time that you didn't have the external threat. I'm talking about the 20th century. But otherwise, you had something that keeps you together, no?
In some way, meaning in opposition to the Soviet Union and the threat of global communism. There's the sense, though. How much the it seems to me that Americans across the nation could not possibly feel as close to one another with respect to that threat as Israelis do with respect to their threats. It's just so much more immediate. It just is, and it's so. What you're saying seems to me true, but not anything like Israel. It's just different. The challenge, the challenge that Americans have, is how to renew the solidarity we feel with one another, the common citizenship that we feel with one another, in the absence of that kind of external threat. And I have to tell you, Shachar, I think that if one looks around America today, one sees such a profound yearning for that kind of belonging. And because the nation, the nation's politics are so polarized, it doesn't offer a receptacle for that longing. You can't feel a part of that, or it's not easy for many people to feel a part of that. And so they put that feeling into other kinds of tribes, which are cropping up in all over America. But the yearning, the fact that there is such a yearning, and the prevalence of the yearning, just shows you that this is a natural human need, and the American nation right now is not filling that need.
There's another aspect to it. It's the collapse of trust in institutions, right? And it's in many ways, I think it's because of the fact that each of us has a voice now. Because 20 years ago, even less than that, you had the anchor on TV. Maybe you were irritated with his obvious bias, his or hers, but at least it was trusted in some way. Nowadays, not only did institutions, and media is not the only one, right? It could be the World Health Organization, and it could be any branch of government, but things that Moshe Dayan used to do, right? and John F. Kennedy used to do, they were kept under the rugs, right? And we kept believing in that institution and put it on a pedestal. And now there are no more pedestals. Everything's out there. We can all scream with capitalized letters. And that yearning, I think, a part of that unfulfillment of that yearning is the fact that you have nothing to trust for real, right? Or that you don't have that something that some institution that will tell you it's all right, it's safe, right? Yeah, everything's all right.
This is exactly why America needs a religious rebound. It's for precisely this reason, because you're right. I think that social media technology has made it possible for every single person to sing a soliloquy off into the void. But very few people are listening, because everyone is saying, everyone is talking to themselves, and very few people listen to one another. It's actually, communication is easier than it's ever been, of course, but everyone is. But communication is therefore harder than it's ever been too.
We're all communicating while in road rage.
Yeah, and exactly. It encourages that part of us because there's a cheap thrill that one can experience by speaking in a way that one would not speak in face-to-face communications in a civilization. In civil
I have
society.
An anecdote story here. I once drove on a highway. I can't remember why, but I drove a little slowly, and someone behind me couldn't pass because other cars and all that. And after a while, went past me, took to the left lane, went past me and wanted to stop or to be in parallel to me and yell at me. And then he saw me and said, "Shachar, what's up?" It was a friend of mine. And he was, all ready to yell. And then, "Hey, Shachar, what are you doing? All right, see you later." So the fact that there's no face-to-face, he was about to yell, and then forgave me in that instance because, I had a face. So social media keeps us from seeing that face. A picture is not enough. All right. So I think we're close to wrap up. It's a heavy conversation, and we were touching a lot of different things. And I told you I'm not sure how to frame this, and we need to chip away at it together and try to see what it is that I want to talk about exactly. But I think we did talk about issues of identity and things that are really interesting to me, and there's a lot more talk to. And again, you mentioned Yoram Chazoni, and I'll mention him for the third time. And to read his books and articles, I think, is a very good thing that will resonate with some of the stuff that we talked about here. Any closing remarks before we go to recommendations?
Well, let me offer some recommendations, because
All right.
Yoram Chazoni is a wise man and an insightful writer, and I think one should read his books and essays. I think that he's most famous for The Virtue of Nationalism, which is his most recent book. It's gotten him a lot of merited attention, but I think that a deeper book that he wrote is called The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, and it's a book that I think The Virtue of Nationalism is a great and good book. The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture I prefer even more. I think that someone who disagrees with Yoram Chazoni, that is a treasured friend and teacher of mine, who thinks about America differently than he does, is Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. And everything that Rabbi Soloveitchik writes, I encourage people to read. He publishes in the Wall Street Journal and in Commentary magazine, and we're sometimes lucky enough to get him writing in our pages in Mosaic. So those are two Jewish voices that I would encourage people to pay attention to. But let me offer a couple of other authors that I think people should not miss if you're interested in some of the stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Available in Hebrew from I think published by Shalem Press is a book in English called The Great Debate by an Israeli-American writer named Yuval Levin. Yuval Levin's Great Debate, The Great Debate, is the best introduction to thinking about the intellectual and moral spirit of the left and the intellectual and moral spirit of the right, and how these two big political movements are inspired by different ideas.
That's about Burke and Thomas Paine.
It's about these two Enlightenment pamphleteers and philosophical writers, Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke, and they actually corresponded with one another. And by looking at their relationship in letters, Yuval Levin uncovers the roots of the left and the right. It's I only mention that because it's a great book, but it's also available in Hebrew, and so I recommend it. For people who want to understand the way that I think about America, and I think the best introduction to America, there is a history of a relatively new history of America called The Land of Hope. It's by a writer named Wilfred McClay, and it's a beautiful book, a comprehensive book. The way that we've been talking about before about 1619 Project and the attempt to criticize heroic figures from the American past, Wilfred McClay in The Land of Hope does not for a second ignore the shameful moments of the American past. But it does not. But those shameful moments do not lead him to despair for America. They and the overcoming of them make him hopeful for the possibility of American renewal. And then let me just say that the wisest man that I've ever read that I know is a person named Leon Kass. Leon Kass has written many books and many essays. I think he wrote the most interesting and perhaps most important commentary on the book of Genesis written in the 20th century. The book is called The Beginning of Wisdom. It's also available in Hebrew, and and he wrote it in English, of course. The book is for people who are secular, who did not grow up in religious homes, but want to think their way through the ideas of Genesis. And the reason that I want to mention him is because Leon Kass has a forthcoming book, a commentary on the book of Exodus. That book is called Founding God's Nation. It's not yet available in Hebrew. It's soon to be published in English, but I recommend both of these books from this excellent writer.
Awesome. I will just add that Yoram Chazoni's book, The Virtue of Nationalism, is going to come out in Hebrew soon. B'Shevach Alumiyut, Sela Meir would be the publisher. All right. Awesome list. I will recommend also someone I mentioned during this episode, an episode with Douglas Murray and Brett Weinstein's podcast. They talk about he's an Englishman, and he came to the U.S. for a visit to see what's happening before the election. And he's given commentary in his brilliant and fascinating way, and I think it's worth a listen from Brett Weinstein's Dark Horse podcast, an episode with Douglas Murray.
Also, one should just say, Douglas Murray's The Death of Europe is also available in Hebrew, I think published by Shiboret.
Yeah. Shiboret, yeah.
And his relatively new book on decadence, maybe, I don't know if it's available in Hebrew or not yet.
I don't think it is yet. And what I said, B'Shevach Alumiyut, it's Shibolet, right? It's not Sela Meir. Apologies. All right. Very well, Jonathan. It was fascinating. Not an easy conversation to have. I think we tried to dig deep, and I think you were a wonderful counterpart to this conversation. Thank you.
Shaka, good to be with you.
Time to play the game.
If you found this episode valuable, please consider subscribing to our podcast, rate it on the different apps, and sharing it with your friends and family, because if you found it valuable, it's probably worth it. Also, help us make this content better. Give us comments, give us feedback via email, follow us on Twitter, or on our feed. Whatever you do to resonate with this content just helps us be better and improve. So we really appreciate it and hope to have you back with us soon. Thank you.